It's June, it's Pride Month, and you are listening to the Thin Pink Line podcast. Greetings from Glasgow. I'm Alan Snedden, and I'll be your host for this, the European LGBT Police Association's second podcast. This episode is all about Pride. However, before we get into that, I'm delighted to announce that Isabel Tapia from our member organisation Gay Les Paul in Spain was elected to be our new Vice President at her AGM held on the 28th of May. Isabel takes over from Maria Lost, who will become one of our ambassadors. My guest for this episode is Steve Taylor from Copenhagen. Steve was elected to the board of the European Pride Organisers Association in 2016 and leads their communications activities. In his day job, he's Director of Communications and Marketing for Copenhagen 2021 World Pride and Eurogames. Before joining Copenhagen 2021, he was a senior volunteer with Pride in London for 7 years and co-founded the UK Pride Organisers Network and has worked in civil society communications and campaigns for almost 20 years. Hello Steve, and thanks for taking the time to join us on the Thin Pink Line. If I could start by asking you, if someone had never heard of Pride before, how would you describe it? And do you think it's still relevant today?
Wow, how would I describe Pride? So I was asked this question about if an alien came to land, how would I describe it to them? And my first question was sort of back at them, which was, well, would you need an event to celebrate equality on the planet that you come from? Because when you think about equality and human rights and LGBTI diversity and inclusion, when you step back and think about it, in some ways it seems quite strange that we need to have a festival or a parade or a march or a protest to mark those, to talk about those issues. But I think it's actually more relevant now than it perhaps has been for maybe 30 years, because there is a rollback on LGBTI equality, not just in Europe, but across the world. Increasing numbers of LGBTI people are facing hate crimes. Increasing numbers are still being legislated against. And we need to stand up. And Pride is the most relevant, most visible way that we can do that, because we take to the streets every year, we get in the way, we cause a bit of disruption. But most of all, we come together as a community and we show that, every single one of us is different and unique, but the one thing that brings us together is the fact that we have this difference, but it's not a difference that should impinge on our daily lives in any way. And we need to stand up for everybody across the globe who's LGBTI, because as the old saying goes, until all of us is free, none of us is free.
Last year, many Pride events had to be cancelled due to the global coronavirus pandemic. What do you think the impact of that has been, and what is the situation this year?
I think the impact of the pandemic on Pride has actually been really interesting, but also really severe, but in another way actually quite positive, if it's possible to find a positive in the pandemic. The negative has been that, of course, lots of Prides last year had to cancel their physical events, their in-person events, and had to pivot to digital events. Some of them didn't survive financially because, by the time lockdowns came in for much of the world in March, April, or even later, they'd already entered into financial contracts for services to deliver their prides, and they lost the money, and so the organisation became bankrupt, and that's a terrible situation. But if there is a good thing, I think it's the fact that the the way in which COVID forced everyone in virtually every walk of life to start doing more things digitally, so prides were forced to think, how can we connect with our community? How can we deliver our Pride event through digital formats? And of course, internationally, we had Global Pride, which was incredible. On the 27th of June last year, we brought 57 million people together in 160 different countries. People who could never have attended a Pride because it's illegal in their country, or it's, their lifestyle is illegal in their country. And I think that the long-term outcome of COVID will be that many prides will not only consider their in-person events in years to come, but they'll consider a hybrid approach where there is at least some digital element for those people who can't attend because they don't like crowds, or because they have a disability, or because they're not out, or because they're living in a country where it would be dangerous for them to participate in Pride. So I think it's a double-edged. It's very much a double-edged sword in relation to in terms of COVID. This year, many prides are coming back, which is great to see. Equally, many are or seem to be pivoting back towards more of a march, and your listeners will be very well aware of the fact that there's a big difference between a parade and a march in terms of what you're allowed to do on the streets. So I think necessity is forcing many of them to consider a march rather than a curated parade. And I think, many are still having digital-only events this year. Some are having both. But it's good to see that some prides are coming back and we're taking over the streets again, because there is a danger, and this would be a danger even in a supposedly liberal democracy like the United Kingdom, where once you give up that space in a town or a city, once you say, okay, we don't need to have the streets for that Saturday in June, it's very difficult to get it back. And I think we need to be absolutely clear when we're saying that we're doing things differently because of COVID, that this isn't a surrendering of that space. It's just a temporary move away, and we will be back.
In our last podcast episode, ILGA Europe explained that a number of LGBTI organisations and advocacy groups had to alter their business models as a result of the pandemic. Some were offering food banks, some online services. Is that something that Pride organisations have been affected by also?
Absolutely. I think if there's one quality that you find in every Pride organiser, it's resilience, probably, and determination. And I think the way that Prides stepped up, they didn't just say, okay, we can't have our march and our festival this year. They said, well, what else can we do? Our community's in need. So as you say, some organised food banks, some organised emergency funding to help people pay for their rent, some organised community initiatives where they'd go and pick up medicines for people, support people who are housebound. If people were feeling nervous about going out during the lockdown when they needed to go out for exercise, they'd buddy up with people. So that it wasn't just prides, but prides were kind of exemplars of how the LGBTI community can and does pull together in times of need. It was amazing to see.
Can you explain what Europride is and tell us about the organisation behind it?
Sure. So Europride began back in 1992, so almost 30 years ago. And the idea came from the prides of London, Amsterdam and Berlin. And they got together and said, what we should do is have one pride every year in Europe that's sort of the focal point, and we'll call it Europride, I guess a bit like Eurovision in a way. And it will go from city to city to city. So it went from London to Amsterdam to Berlin. And since then, it's happened every year, except sadly last year because of COVID-19. And it really allows the Pride movement in Europe to highlight a particular Pride. It also brings lots of people in. Pride tourism is now a big business, and it's been to some truly amazing and incredible cities, and will continue to do so. In 2010 it went to Warsaw, which is unimaginable now, which just shows the way in which rights can be rolled back. In 2015 it went to Riga, the first time in a former Soviet country. Last year should have been Thessaloniki, but that's now going to be 2024. But next year it goes to Belgrade, first time in the Western Balkans. Belgrade Pride, not many years ago, certainly within the last 15 years, basically was a riot every time, because nationalists and far-right idiots would turn up and smash up the city every time Pride took place. So the fact that Europride can go to cities like Riga and Belgrade is truly amazing. And the organisation behind it, the European Pride Organisers Association, again, it was founded by the same three prides in London in '92, and we have about 140 members, and the members are pride organisations themselves. We've got virtually all the capital city prides in Europe. And we're there to support and represent the pride movement. So we do that at the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and at kind of international level with representations to the media. We corralled the support of a number of our prides very early last year to support the pride movement in Poland. We raised almost €20,000 to provide training and support to pride organisers there, because they really are facing enormous challenges. So there's a whole load of different things that we do. We are 8 volunteers, board members, all elected by the members. We're there to help and support the Pride movement as best we can. I should say there isn't a Europride in years when World Pride is in Europe. And so therefore there's no Europride this year because World Pride is in Copenhagen.
You mentioned World Pride, which takes place, as you said, in Copenhagen and Malmo in August this year. Can you provide us with an update on that event and what attendees can expect?
Sure. I mean, I joined the Copenhagen team about 18 months ago, just as the pandemic was starting to emerge. And it really, we've spent the last 18 months not planning one event this August, but planning 3, because we've had to plan for the full event if the world was opened up fully, a sort of middle ground with some restrictions in place, and then an entirely digital event. And it's only, thanks to the prevarications of the Danish government, it's only in the last 4 weeks that we've actually known that by August we'll be in that second scenario. So we've had to change some events. We've had to change from the big parade into a number of smaller marches. We've had to move the main stage from World Pride Square to a viewing area in a really beautiful park just north of the city. But it will still be an incredible event. We've got dozens of venues, more than 100 cultural events, the biggest ever LGBTI human rights forum with prime ministers, princesses, UN high commissioners, incredible lineup of speakers. And we're also this year hosting Eurogames, the first time those two things have come together. So we've got tournaments in 29 different sports, a sports village on the waterside, so you can take a dip in the harbour, have a drink with your friends. There's a huge amount of activity taking place across the city from the 12th to the 22nd of August.
And wouldn't it be great if we could have a World Pride or a Euro Pride one day in the likes of Moscow? If you could pick a country or a city where you would most like to see a Pride event take place, where would that be and why?
Gosh, there's so many. I mean, you mentioned Moscow. It's never had Europride. I think Europride in Moscow would be truly incredible. And actually, just as an aside, I would really recommend anybody who wants to visit a really interesting Pride to consider Barents Pride. It takes place inside the far north of Norway, inside the Arctic Circle, just a few miles from the Russian border. And it's a pride for Russian LGBTI people and activists, and they come across the border. They have a pride in this tiny little Arctic Circle town, and then they go home the following day. It's a really incredibly moving event and incredibly powerful. So I'd love to see Pride in Moscow. Sadly, I think we'll probably have to wait for Putin to disappear under whatever method that takes. But I think that would be really life-affirming and life-changing for so many people in Russia. Beyond Europe, I mean, there's so many places. We do now have prides in the Arab world. We have a pride in Beirut, as much as people have tried to stop it. This is in the Middle East, where we should be really looking towards getting LGBTI equality to the place where we can have pride events. And of course, many countries in Central Africa, especially Uganda, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, where reform is much needed, and we really need to get Pride moving on. It's great to see Pride in India, but the other enormous country, China, Pride is technically illegal there. There are attempts to have some prides, but there's a huge way to go. So, we are incredibly privileged here in Europe to be able to have Pride in most of our countries, but there's a long way to go globally.
And lastly, given the recent decision to ban uniformed LGBTI police officers from taking part in New York City Pride, what do you consider to be the wider implications and future for LGBTI police officers' involvement in Pride events?
It's an incredibly complex issue, and because I knew I was doing this, I actually asked quite a lot of colleagues in Prides across Europe what their thoughts were on the decision of Heritage of Pride. And of course, there's been controversy in London over banning the police from Pride. And I think the simple answer is that there is no simple answer. I don't think that any Pride in the world would prevent a police officer from attending Pride out of uniform, and nor should they. But I think when it comes to police in uniform, I think it's the duty of any Pride organizer to listen to the local community. And if the local community are saying the presence of uniform police taking part in the parade or in the march makes us feel unsafe, and that there is, weight to that claim, then I don't think that can be ignored, and nor should it be ignored. But I absolutely don't accept that, I don't subscribe to the ACAB agenda. I do think there are police officers in parts of the world that do terrible things to LGBTI people, but there are doctors in parts of the world that do terrible things to LGBTI people. And I actually think that, by listening to the community, we can ensure that policing at Pride is sustainable. Because I think one of the things that I fear is that if we start to ban police from Pride because of something that's happened several thousand miles away, that will sow distrust between Pride and the community and police. And I know from many years of helping to organise Pride in London that there are the police in the parade, but there's also the police on the outside of the parade, and yes, they're there to keep people safe, but they're also they're enjoying themselves, I think, largely. And I think if suddenly the police were to be seen completely as an enemy in that situation, I think it would sow distrust, and I think it would lead to a deterioration of the quality of policing and the protection that the police provide to Pride events. And, we know that Pride needs police protection because there have been conspiracies to attack Pride events in Amsterdam, in London in recent years. So I think it's relying on every Pride organizer to make the decision that's right for their location based on community engagement. But I certainly don't think that we should be advocating for an all-out ban on any group other than groups that are human rights abusers, like weapons manufacturers, who I don't think have any place at Pride.
And normally when the EGPA attend an event, we would ask the event organisers if it's okay to wear a uniform, because I think we understand that for some in society there is still a lack of trust, and that will vary depending on which part of the world you're from.
Well, I think there's also an opportunity for the police and for Pride organisers to use it as an opportunity to help to create that trust and to rebuild that trust. It could be a really useful opportunity, and not one that I think should be wasted. And I should say that this is my personal opinion and not that of EPOA, because it doesn't take an opinion on it as an organisation.
It is certainly a debate which I'm sure lots of our listeners will have an opinion on. And of course, you can let us know your thoughts by sending us a voice message via the link in the show notes. I'd like to thank Steve Taylor for being our guest. That concludes our podcast. However, before we go, I'd like to remind you that you can send us a voice message up to a minute long using the link in the show notes. Let us know your thoughts about this episode, and as this is Pride Month, why not tell us about a memorable moment that you had at Pride? Maybe it was your first ever Pride. Just start the message with your name and where you are from. If we get some good responses, we can share them in our next podcast. Remember to subscribe so that you can be notified when our next podcast is available. Bye for now, and thanks for listening to The Thin Pink Line.